There are stories in maritime lore that whisper rather than shout. Stories that do not begin with a crashing wave or a blazing headline, but with something quieter, an ordinary moment. A man on a boat, the simple rhythm of wind against canvas before the world folds inside out. Stephen Callahan's story is one of those. It starts with a small yacht, a long horizon, and a man who believed he knew the sea intimately. But the Atlantic, patient and ancient, has ways of reminding even the most experienced sailor that familiarity is not the same as control, and sometimes a life can pivot not with a dramatic thunderclap, but with a sudden jolt in the dark, a sound that doesn't make sense until it does. Before that night, Stephen was just a man chasing the quiet thrill that only the open ocean can offer. A naval architect and seasoned sailor, he trusted his hands, his tools, and the language of the wind. He had built his own little yacht, the Napoleon Solo, shaped plank by plank with a kind of affection that only people who build their own vessels understand. To him, the boat was not just a craft, it was an extension of himself, a place of freedom, a partner in solitude. He left for the Atlantic crossing in 1982 with a mix of confidence and curiosity. The ocean was familiar but never predictable. That unpredictability was part of the charm. The days fell into a gentle rhythm, sunrises blooming over the endless blue, the clean hiss of water along the hull, the small domestic rituals of life aboard, boiling water, tightening cordage, checking instruments. He moved through it all with a quiet competence. It felt like a personal world where time softened around the edges. But storms have their own schedules, and the sea, when it wants to, can rewrite a life very quickly. On a night swallowed by darkness, with winds that muttered restlessly but showed no great threat, Stephen felt the Napoleon Solo shudder, a deep, unnatural impact, a noise that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. He leapt to the deck confused. There was no clear culprit, no reef, no vessel lights, no shape in the water, only the cruel realization spreading under his feet. The hull was breached. Water surged in with a force that felt personal. The sea had come inside. He didn't panic. Years of experience kept him focused. He assessed. He reacted. But the Atlantic is indifferent to competence. Despite his efforts, the boat was giving up. It sank into the black water with a slow, almost apologetic descent, leaving Stephen alone on the surface in a small, inflatable life raft, a fragile bubble of fabric separating him from the vast, hungry depths. The first hours were defined by shock, the kind that doesn't feel like fear so much as a numb detachment. The mind protects itself by focusing on tasks. Inflate the raft fully, secure what little gear he had managed to grab, take inventory of the emergency supplies, calculate rations. He had a spear gun, a few tools, minimal food, and a solar still designed to collect small amounts of drinkable water. It wasn't much, but it was something. At sunrise, the reality sharpened. The yacht was gone. He was drifting in the middle of one of the largest oceans on Earth, in a raft no larger than a small bed. The nearest land was hundreds of miles away, and no one knew where he was. But Stephen understood something many in his situation might not. Survival is not won through sudden heroic acts, but through small, stubborn decisions carried out day after day. A quiet commitment to routine, even when routine feels futile. He reminded himself of this as the days began to stretch. The first week was a study in disorientation. The raft bobbed relentlessly, rising and dropping with passing swells. each movement unpredictable. Salt spray crusted his skin, wearing it down. Everything became damp. Clothes, tools, even hope. When sun blazed overhead, the raft turned blisteringly hot, trapping heat like a greenhouse. When night fell, the temperature dropped, and Stephen shivered despite the humidity. There was no comfort, only adjustment. But he was not passive. He improvised. He examined every part of the raft, searching for weaknesses. He reinforced seams. He fixed punctures from curious fish or passing debris. He crafted a makeshift spear from bits of metal and tubing, sharpening it with patient determination. He learned the slow language of waves and the faster, more urgent vocabulary of storms. The ocean seemed to test him through cycles, days of deceptive calm followed by days of brutal wind. He learned not to trust periods of peace. They often meant something stronger was gathering just beyond sight. Storms rolled through like immense creatures, lifting the raft on towering waves. Stephen clung to the edges, bracing himself. The raft twisted and bucked. Water poured in. He bailed tirelessly. Fatigue became a constant companion, settling into his muscles like a second weight. And then there were the sharks, silent shadows under the raft. They circled at odd hours, nudging the bottom, attracted by the movement above. Stephen learned to remain still when they were near. The raft vibrated with each curious bump. He knew one good tear could send him into the water with them. The sea, for all its vast emptiness, was full of life, most of which had no interest in him. But the sharks were attentive. They reminded him daily that survival was not merely a challenge. It was a negotiation. Food was another negotiation entirely. The raft's emergency rations were meager, meant for short-term survival, not prolonged isolation. He had to hunt. Using his improvised spear, he learned to catch dorado, fast, strong fish that shimmered like molten gold in the sunlight. But spearing them required timing and patience. Misses were draining, successes exhilarating. Each fish he caught felt like a momentary victory in a larger, uncertain battle. He carved the flesh carefully, drying strips when possible, eating raw portions when necessary. The taste was sharp, almost metallic, but it kept him alive. The bones cut his fingers and gums, but he accepted the pain. Pain meant he was still here. Water was the true currency of survival. The solar stills, designed to convert seawater to fresh water through evaporation, worked inconsistently. Sometimes they yielded enough to quench his thirst. Other times they failed entirely, leaving him licking condensation from their surfaces or waiting for rain. He learned to treat rain clouds like sacred events. When a storm approached, he positioned himself perfectly to collect as much water as possible. He opened his mouth to the sky. He spread clothing to catch droplets. Each taste of fresh rain felt miraculous, softening the dryness that lived permanently in his throat. As the weeks deepened into months, time changed shape. Days no longer felt linear. Instead, they circled around him like the currents that carried his raft. He tracked time with marks on the raft, but those marks became abstract, symbols rather than anchors. His thoughts wandered between clarity and exhaustion. He remembered past voyages, people he loved, mistakes he had made, small joys he missed. Reflection became a survival tactic. The sea stripped away distraction, leaving him alone with the core of himself. There were hallucinations at times, moments where sunlight played tricks through the fabric of the raft, making him think he saw shapes, boats, or distant islands. He learned not to trust his eyes immediately. He waited for patterns to stabilize. Most didn't. Birds appeared occasionally. They perched on the raft, watching him with simple curiosity. Their presence reminded him that land existed somewhere, even if it felt impossibly far away. He spoke to them sometimes, not out of madness, but out of a quiet need to hear his own voice in the emptiness. Storms remained the greatest threat. One particular storm rattled him more deeply than the rest. The waves towered over the raft, lifting it so high that the horizon vanished. Lightning tore the sky open. Thunder vibrated through his bones. The raft twisted violently. He felt the seams strain. Water flooded in faster than he could bail. He yelled, not at the storm, but into it, as if asserting his presence against the overwhelming force around him. When morning finally came and the storm withdrew, leaving the ocean strangely flat, Stephen felt a quiet gratitude simply for surviving the night. He examined the raft. It was battered, but intact. So was he. Around the midpoint of his ordeal, he encountered a ship, a moment that could have ended everything. He spotted its shape on the horizon, faint but unmistakable. His heart surged. He waved. He shouted. He used his mirror to reflect sunlight toward it. But the ship continued on its path, distant and indifferent. It never changed course. He watched it move away until it faded into the blue. The silence afterward was heavier than any storm. Despair settled on him, thick and suffocating. But he also knew despair was a luxury he could not afford for long. Eventually, he forced himself back into routine. Survived the next hour, then the next. His body weakened. Salt sores opened on his skin. His eyes stung constantly. His joints ached. Hunger lived inside him like a second presence, quiet, but insistent. But his spirit, the worn, did not fracture. There was a resilience in him, stubborn, unglamorous, persistent. He understood that survival was not a single act of heroism, but a chain of small decisions made despite fear and exhaustion. On the 76th day, when he was thinner than he had ever been, when his mind drifted between exhaustion and fragile alertness, he saw something different on the horizon, a speck, a shape. It moved with purpose, not like a cloud, not like debris. It grew, slowly but undeniably, a boat. His heartbeat quickened, but he didn't assume salvation. He lifted himself as high as he could. He signaled with the mirror. He waved. He shouted with every last shred of voice he still possessed. This time, the boat changed course. When the rescuers reached him, they found a man who looked nearly hollow, but whose eyes were still bright with life. He had endured nearly 11 weeks on the open ocean alone, armed only with a raft, a spear, ingenuity, and a will to live that outpaced the vastness around him. He stepped, or was helped, onto the rescue vessel with a kind of disbelief. The world felt too solid after so long in motion. Voices sounded too loud. The simple act of standing under a stable sky brought tears to his eyes. Not dramatic sobs, just quiet, grateful tears. Stephen Callahan survived 76 days adrift in the Atlantic. His story became a testament to human endurance, to the quiet strength that can rise in the harshest conditions. But he never framed himself as a hero. He described his experience as a conversation with the sea, a negotiation between fragility and persistence, a reminder that the line between life and death can be both razor-thin and astonishingly resilient. In the end, his survival was not just about skill or tools or even luck. It was about the steady, unbroken determination to keep choosing life, one small decision at a time, across 76 days of isolation, uncertainty, and oceanic vastness. And that is how a man alone on a life raft, battered by storms and circled by sharks, found his way back to the world, not through grand gestures, but through quiet endurance, the kind that whispers rather than shouts, and lingers long after the waves have settled.